Hi, my name is Julia Goldberg, and I'm in the elementary cohort of the MAT program. And my research project is called The 2 R's of Stopping Classroom Disruption: Responses and Relationships. So first I'll give you the layout of my presentation for you. I'm going to give you an overview of my research, starting with my research question and going through until my concluding thoughts and my next steps. And this is the same way that I went about my own research. So my research question is, how do I effectively respond to 3 students in my class who consistently disrupt lessons by using phrasing and silence and relationship building? And I also wondered how to do this in a way that showed high expectation for these students, and also showed respect for who they are as individuals. And I asked this question because this came to be a repeated issue in my class, that these students would disrupt lessons, and it would lead other students in my class to also disrupt lessons, and it would disrupt learning overall. And I also wanted to see how I could change my phrasing to be more intentional, because maybe these students weren't responding to my responses to them because they didn't understand what I was asking for them to do, or I wanted to see if building relationships would help, because maybe there wasn't a foundation of trust in our relationship, so they didn't have the desire to listen to me because they didn't trust me in what I was saying. And to give you some background information, I taught in a 4th grade class at the Boston Teachers Union School in Jamaica Plain. And this was an interesting school because it's a pilot school, so they had a little bit of freedom to do something cool. It's a teacher-led school, so that means that teachers make decisions together. They make the administrative decisions together. So this led to an environment where teachers were very collaborative with each other and also with their students. And there were 25 students in my class, and it was a very diverse class. There were 10 Hispanic students, 10 black students, and 5 white students. And this led for me to have to respond differently to students in different ways, just because there was different cultures within the classroom. There were 6 English language learners and 6 students on individualized education plans, which also was part of that diversity. And so I gave the students who I focused my research on the names Alyssa, Kate, and Alana for my research. And again, they were constantly distracting others and during our lessons and did not stop when I asked them to. So in collecting my data, I used many different sources. I started with my research review, so I wanted to figure out what kinds of responses I could try. So I looked at different literature for tips on that. And I also used student and teacher interviews. I used student interviews because I really wanted to get these students' input, these particular 3 students, and ask them why weren't they listening to me and what kind of response would help them to follow my directions during the lesson. And then I also interviewed teachers to see what these teachers were doing in their own classrooms. And I used video recording and my journaling to document my process, video recording my lessons and my responses from the beginning of my research until the end to see what responses were successful and what were not. And I also collected and organized my data to find patterns in what was successful. So here's an example of my data collection. And while you don't need to look at the specifics of the data, I'll show you the way I organized it. I started with just writing the changes I was trying to make in the responses to my students, so I could document that process. And then for each student, in each of the 3 individual students, I wrote what their behavior was like before I made the change in response, and then their behavior after I changed my responses. And then also what our relationship was like as I was trying to make changes and build more relationships with these students. So these are my main findings that I came to based on my research and my evidence. And I mainly came to these findings based on trying specific responses that the resource review suggested and that other teachers suggested. So what was the most successful was building relationships with students. And I found that none of the other responses I tried were successful until I had that foundation in relationships. Because these students came to trust me and listen to me. And once I had that, when I improved my other responses, they did listen. Also, coming closer to students. With proximity, that was very helpful, putting my hand on their desk or standing closer to them to get their attention. And then lastly, being brief and direct with students was very important, instead of asking them a question or giving a long explanation. So for the success of relationship building, I found that just getting to know students and showing them that I was interested in their interests was really important to just build this foundation of trust. So with Alyssa, I talked to her a lot about the show Glee, because that's a show that I watch as well. So I would just ask her about an episode or character, and it really formed that trust. And with Alana, I knew that she liked science a lot, so I would ask her to stay and help me clean up the materials. And seeing that I was interested in that interest of hers was very important to building that trust. And then I also showed students that I was interested in the way that they needed to learn, in their learning needs. So I talked to Kate before we started a book group and telling her I know that she wants to talk a lot about how much she loves this book, but she has to leave some space for other students to talk as well. So talking through that with her showed her that I was interested in her participation in the discussion. And I also talked with Alyssa about good times to go to the closet during my lessons so that she wasn't going up while we were talking together as a class, and that she waited to get her materials until after I was done talking to the class. So the other thing that was helpful, as I said, was increasing proximity with students. So as you can see here, I was standing and put my hand right on Alyssa's desk to signal for her attention. And she's actually dropping her pencil and looking right up at me. So just getting closer to her and having that proximity with her was really helpful to get her attention. I also would stand near Alana's desk and read a passage over her to help get her attention as well. And lastly, brief and direct responses were really important to getting students' attention and to following my instructions for them. So for example, I told Alana I would take her pen until the end of the day so that she could focus on listening when she was using this kind of cool pen and showing it to everybody else. And just being that very brief and direct about that was very helpful to move on with the lesson and to stop disruption. And as I'll show you here, I told Kate to have her eyes on me while I was giving instructions. And I also will use proximity, so I kind of combine responses, which was also helpful. But you'll see that I was giving the instruction to the class as well, and then I gave it directly to her. You need to have your eyes on here and listening to my instructions. So, as you can see, she did have her eyes on me. She looked behind her because the teacher was actually sitting right behind her, so she was kind of checking in with her. But she did look at me when I said that, and put my hand on her desk. So being brief and direct was really important as well. So I wanted to note that this is a continuous process. So I would respond to students, practice my new responses, and build relationships. But I needed to ask myself, was this successful or not, and adjust when necessary. For example, Alyssa needed more of an explanation of why she couldn't, for example, go to the closet at the time that I said you can't go to the closet. Because she needed to know what was happening next. So as I found this out, I asked myself, why wasn't she listening? When I told her that direct response, then I adjusted, I gave her more of an explanation, and she Okay, I'll wait. So it was just about reading these students and getting to know them. So, in conclusion, I now have a much better understanding of the best ways to respond and relate to students to minimize disruption in behavior in the classroom. I know that I need to notice their behavior, but also, more importantly, consider their backgrounds and their interests and their ways of relating to the world, who they are as a whole child. Because different students will respond to me in different ways, as Alyssa was an example of this. And even in different classrooms with different cultures, different responses may be more successful. I know that building relationships is the most important thing, and it must be formed from the beginning so that trust can be formed. And as an organization teaching tolerance writes about, I want to think about how I'm not managing my students, because if I work with students to figure out how they'll be able to engage in a lesson, I'll be more successful in keeping students from disrupting, and they'll be more engaged in the lesson as well. And finally, that there's more teacher training needed on this topic, especially for new teachers, so that they can understand the complexities of behavior in the classroom and discuss together strategies to respond to students. Thank you. Any questions?
You came in the middle of the year when you started to do your student teaching. How would you, if you had that class from the very beginning, what do you think you'd do with a fresh class?
That's a great question. That's something I've also really thought about throughout this process. I definitely would make my set my expectations with my students, because as I said, I don't want to be managing the students. I want them to have some sort of a say. And I would also, as I said, build that relationship from the beginning of the year, because I wasn't necessarily in the classroom every day at the beginning of the year. It was a little bit different than being the teacher. So from the beginning of the year, I would do activities where I would get to know my students, like having an all about me, where students get to draw and write about themselves and their lives, because I feel like that is key, knowing your students and knowing what they need.
Did the students, these 3 particular students, did they know you were trying to modify their behavior, and did that affect your experiment, do you think?
That's a great question. They didn't know. So when I interviewed them, it was actually just part of my relationship building with them. So I really made an effort to get to know them outside of class. So I would say, can you just stay for 5 minutes, help me clean up the materials? And we would talk about Glee, we would talk about whatever it was. And then I would say, hey, how did you feel about that lesson? I noticed that you weren't really responding to me when I went up to you. Why do you think that happened? So it became just a very casual conversation, but it helped me build relationships with them, and they came to trust me and know that I want their feedback. And then it also helped in my research.
Great, thanks.
I thought your presentation was such a great example of like the inquiry mindset, because instead of problematizing their behavior, you like created that slide with like the chart and inputting like what they did and what you did and the result. And so I'm curious, like, is that something you envision yourself like carrying forward and continuing to track student behavior in this way? Or do you think that eventually you'll have internalized all these things? Like, how do you envision this going forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I really liked tracking my own behavior and students' responses, because I think so often we're looking at student behavior and we're not really looking at what our own that's causing that. So I think I'm not sure the way that I would necessarily document it, but I think if any situation would come up where I was focusing on a student behavior, I would also want to document my own as well. Because I think that was a really important process to see what was happening from both sides.
One of the greatest questions that our young teachers ask is, the friend authority line. Am I too much of a friend to my students? Am I enough of an authority? Do you have any revelations about that after this? Because it sounds like you were doing both. You were giving specific responses, and yet you were forging relationships. That's a friendship conversation about Glee, right? Maybe not so much cleaning up science materials, but what you love about rocks and minerals could be a friend. So do you have any revelations about how you might do that going forward?
Yeah, I think that it's very important to just keep that balance, because if I'm talking about Glee, it could easily just become a conversation, and I could easily just not want to bring up what had happened in class and just have this friendly conversation. But I think it's also important to balance the teacher side, where I want to help these students listen to my lessons and engage in these lessons. So I think that keeping that balance between what I want to see in students' behavior and talking to them about that, and not just about their interests, but I think that's the way to kind of find that balance.
Thank you.
Thank you.